Right. Thank you for that introduction. And thank you also, and Michael, for inviting me to speak with you today, and Kelly for help with getting the session set up. Last time I spoke at the Quantum Bootcamp, I discussed the parallel between quantum physics and Asian philosophy. And that project was an attempt to grasp the implications of quantum physics for macroscopic human and non-human life by looking at ancient traditions that for millennia have engaged directly with questions of mind, action, and strategy in the world. And that resulted in the book Snapshots from Home, which I'll give a small advertisement for here. The project I want to talk about today followed on the book, but does build on some of its themes, but takes them in a more experiential direction. And in particular, both projects share a question about the possibility of repositioning the apparatus, of getting outside of ourselves enough and outside of the stories we tell about ourselves in the world to open spaces for exploring a broader range of potentials for addressing some of the existential problems that we face as a planet. So the origins of the Mapping the Empire project are somewhat unusual. While visiting an acupuncturist about 8 years ago, she at a certain point pulled me off the table and set up an exercise, which is referred to as a family constellation. And I'll say more about this shortly. But I became very curious about an experience of quantum effects, or something that has no explanation in classical physics. And this was followed by several years of more personal work with family constellations myself, and then informal exploration of a more global systems approach with Nicola Mackay. And we then received 3 years funding from the US Human Family Unity Foundation to do exploratory research around a question of the potential adaptation of the modality to more global phenomena. Now, I will start by talking about the experience of quantum effects as it relates to the constellations modality, and then present the broad outlines of the funded project and some of the further questions it has raised. As this was all very exploratory, I focus less on results than some interesting questions that it poses for further investigation. Now, I want to start by positioning toward the subject matter and 3 types of reactions that I've had to it. The first are those who have had experience with the constellations and tend to find the project fascinating, including a few who had been skeptical before the experience. The second are those who see something interesting going on, but put it in a framework that's more understandable, such as a role play or the subjective consciousness of the participants. The third is those who appear to be a bit spooked and resist even looking at it or are just silent. If you find yourself in the latter category, I would ask you to pause and think about where the reaction is coming from. Now, there's a British news quiz called Have I Got News for You that presents 4 images and asks the contestants to say which of them is the outlier. Now, I want to start with a similar exercise with the 4 images on the screen. I later noticed that there are actually 2 ways to cut into this, but my initial concern was to highlight the quantum technologies relating to quantum computing, nuclear weapons, and artificial intelligence, and to point to a tendency to accept the machines as necessary, if not always desirable, on the one hand, while quantum consciousness in humans tends to be quickly dismissed. Now, the tendency to turn away from the latter arises, at least in part, I would suggest, from a range of binary oppositions and assumptions embedded in beliefs about science. The first assumption is that the world is mechanical and machines are good. They represent the progress of science. By contrast, anything having to do with human consciousness is New Age or Eastern mysticism or fairy synapses in the brain, and thus pseudoscience. Second, the language of science has historically been constructed in opposition to religion, indigenous, or Asian knowledge, And this goes hand in hand with an inability to see the suppression of different knowledge traditions in the context of empire and modernization. And third, it's worth considering whether beliefs about science and technology are historically and culturally contingent, originating with Galileo, Newton, and Descartes. And many of these beliefs are retained in quantum science, such as the emphasis on mathematics, machines, and objectivity, even while quantum assumptions that the observer is entangled with the apparatus of measurement actually shares more with the wrong side of the binary. So anyway, if you find yourself reacting with skepticism, disbelief, or discomfort, I just suggest that you sit with it, think about where it's coming from. The cognitive dissonance, which I'll return to at the end, is in my view central to the whole exercise. This is my attempt to make sense of something that is hard to grasp and that I'm still trying to understand myself after some 8 years of working with it. As my research partner and I had complementary skills, during the project, I relied primarily on her understanding of how the constellations work. I've since been engaging in an international training to acquire a better understanding for myself, which is still underway and has broadened my perspective on what we're doing considerably. But I should also mention that the process of making sense, not least as this relates to existing literatures across a range of disciplines, has largely come after working with the modality, and many of the interesting questions require more interdisciplinary input than I could possibly provide on my own. But hopefully that will happen at some point. Now, the experiential modality, which is referred to as family and systemic constellations, was developed in the 1960s by a German named Bert Hellinger. Hellinger started as a priest and a missionary and later became a psychotherapist. Family systems therapy generally looks at family as a system and how different families stand in relation to one another in the whole rather than individuals per se. Hellinger's constellations were distinct insofar as he brought in volunteers who knew nothing about the family or the particular problem. The client would then, there would be a big audience there, and the client would select individuals to represent members from the family systems, including members from earlier generations. Now, this different approach has two implications. First of all, the representers are engaging with something that they know little or nothing about. And second of all, the client stands outside saying very little and observes a system which they're a part of, but without being actively involved. So the notion of a representer who's a stranger unsettles the more common distinction between third-party objective experience, which we associate with science, and first-party subjective experience, which we associate with the individual. The quantum effects regard a form of entangled knowledge that is expressed by a second party, that is the representer, who experiences affect, including bodily sensations that arise within the space they represent. So the representative phenomena is key to the quantum effects that arouse my curiosity, and what I hope to unpack a bit today. The modality was influenced by other family systems methods such as Gestalt, but also by German phenomenology, and as well as Hellinger's experience as a priest in South Africa, where he for 16 years observed the healing practices of the Zulu peoples. Hellinger is also said to be inspired by Chinese philosophy, and in particularly the importance of looking at the interplay of opposites and seeking truth, which can be found in Taoism and Confucianism. So the constellations shift emphasis to the impact of the system on the individual parts. Phenomenology is evident in the emphasis on experience and consciousness. The focus on the family as a transgenerational phenomena resonates with the relational philosophy of African Ubuntu, or as well as Buddhism or Taoism. And all of these resonate with assumptions of quantum theory, complementarity, and non-local entanglement. Now, I should mention that the practice of family and systemic constellations have become a global phenomenon. This training I'm in involves both trainers and students from all over the world, which is absolutely fascinating. But the constellations have also been controversial, and I think particularly in Germany. There are a range of different reasons for this. One of them is Hellinger's personality, which was known to be quite authoritarian, and some of this seeped into his particular use of concepts, although I think later generations have changed that part of it. Also, difference between its underlying assumptions and those of psychotherapy, which has been a source of discussion within the psychotherapeutic community, or claims that it's a form of quantum mysticism and thus not real science. And I'll come back to this later at the end. Now, while most often associated with family systems, the modality has been widely used in organizations and even corporations, and also for conflict analysis. So it relates to a broader category of systemic constellations. And I'm just providing a nutshell and oversimplified view of what is really quite a complex way of thinking. The first, as I've already said, is focused on working with the system rather than the individual, and the notion of an informing field, which I'll return to shortly. Second, the entanglements may be both spatial in the present and temporal, connected to the past and earlier generations. Third, everyone in a system has a right to belong. Entanglements with the past are obstacles to belonging, or they arise from obstacles to belonging that happened with the exclusion of members from a system and the silence surrounding these exclusions. So these unresolved patterns are then said to be passed on to future generations who may carry loyalties and burdens of the past without necessarily being aware of them. And so, for instance, Hellinger did a lot of work in post-war Germany regarding transgenerational entanglements with people who had been involved in the children of people who had been involved in the Nazi regime during World War II. So the constellation modality makes it possible to get a more complete view of entanglements within a system, which generally arise from the unseen parts. So acknowledging what is and giving a place to the unseen parts potentially provides release from an entanglement, which captures the notion that was expressed in our 2020 article, "To see is to break an entanglement." So now one point that is emphasized repeatedly within the family and systemic constellations community is that the intention of this kind of exercise is not to fix a problem. Any resolution arises from the system or the field rather than the client, the facilitator, or the representatives. Although there is something of a dialectical relationship to by the latter who are seeing what is and accepting it without judgment, regardless of how beautiful or horrific. Now, the question is how to think about the relationship between parts and wholes within a system, or the representer phenomena as it relates to an informing field. I'll start with the concept of emptiness, partly because Buddhism is the day's focus, but also because it's useful for understanding both points. Now, as Jay Carfield already discussed, a common metaphor for Buddhist emptiness is the net of infra, which is said to illustrate the interbeing of all things. And as he already said, it's the net's made up of these jewels at each vortex, which then reflect all the other jewels and is holographic. So if you're looking at this in terms of a systemic field of a family or organization, the nodes or the jewels are the members of whatever system's being looked at. And this is not nicely maps onto what Garfield discussed as Nagarjuna's relationship between emptiness and dependent origination or arising, by which we are products of the causes, conditions, and relations that have shaped us, and particularly in regard to the constellation, this idea that who we are in the present can't be detached from all of those generations that have preceded us, any one of whom, had they been in a different place or formed a different relationship, would have changed the likelihood of our birth, put it that way. There are other conceptual languages closer to physics that describe similar part-whole relationship. David Bohm articulated the difference in terms of an explicate order, which is the fragmented material and social reality we perceive, and as distinct from the relational wholeness of the implicate order, which contains all the memories, practices, and potentials across time, or quantum field theory, or Rupert Sheldrake's morphic field, which is often drawn on to make sense of the constellations. But also, I think it's very similar to much indigenous thought. So Buddhism also includes a notion of emptiness of mind, which is central to meditation, as well as ancient traditions of warfare. And emptiness of mind is the opposite of linear narrative thinking. It requires creating distance from the words running through our minds in order to open the senses to a larger context. So you might say if much of the social science is tasked with putting experience into categories, the constellations, by contrast, involve a phenomenological stance of being empty to the categories and stories through which we see the world. So to empty ourselves of previous convictions in order to have a broader sense experience that's larger than the individual and arises from the emptiness of the system. So some actually refer to the constellations as more of a meditation than a therapy. Now, the representative phenomena rests on this contrast between a fragmented conventional reality and a more holistic, holographic, and entangled reality. And it replaces either reality or mysticism, the binary that we usually refer to, with a relational consciousness that's both and that is immanent in the world rather than transcendent. So it requires thinking about ourselves and everything around us as entangled phenomena rather than things or objects or purely individual. Now, constellations are an experiential modality. Our project involved an experiment as well. So experiment in our use is not how we usually talk about it in social sciences, but rather referred broadly to the attempt to adapt something from one use to another. The research was exploratory. It was continuously evolving and changing as we experimented with different things. But given an experiment involving an experiential modality, it's useful to think about the shared roots of experience and experiment in the Latin experior, to gain knowledge through repeated trials. So the modality focuses more on experience and the experiment on procedures for conducting research. The ones more concerned with our position as participant observers in the experiment of life, and the other on the meaning of good science. But there's a tension here between a modality that involves an experience of quantum effects and definitions of what constitutes good scientific research or good objective scientific research. And that tension is arguably also there in quantum physics. Bohr, for instance, grappled with the meaning of objectivity, which is in tension with the whole idea that the observer is entangled with the apparatus of measurement in quantum physics. Now, the Mapping the Empire project, as already said, was undertaken with Nicola Mackay, who was trained by Hellinger and had 20 years experience as a constellations facilitator. We started with the question of whether entanglements extend beyond the family, which is the focus of family constellations, to larger global systems. Hellinger spoke of greater forces that impacted on systems, including forced displacement, war, famine, genocide, etc. And Mackay, in working with individuals as a therapist, had seen considerable evidence of the experience of these larger forces, such as, the Irish famine, dispossession, enslavement, appearing in the family fields of individuals in the present. But in the context of what we were doing, rather than looking from the individual out, as you would in a therapy situation, we started with the larger experiences of historical trauma and memories attached to them in the present to see whether patterns would be evident when working at this level. And as we began during the pandemic, we worked with an online adaptation of the modality and with a group of volunteers who met once a month over a 2.5-year period. based on the ethical guidelines we put together, we only involved volunteers who had experience with and training in family or systems constellations. Many of them were systems practitioners themselves. We wanted to have people who had worked with their own family entanglements, who had experience with the modality, and thus some idea what to expect, to avoid any unnecessary triggering of past traumas as in those who were involved. And we really weren't sure what we were going to experience. So, but the sessions were undertaken blind, and I'll explain. I'll return to this in a moment and talk about it in somewhat more depth. In addition to the therapeutic volunteers who acted as representers, a separate but parallel group of PhD RAs, a few of whom I think are here today, looked at the relationship between trending events in the present, uses of memory in these contexts, its relationship to specific historical traumas, as well as future potentials relating to both. This information then fed into the formulation of intentional questions for the mapping, as well as providing an empirical backdrop for looking at the relationship between the maps and what was seen and unseen in the world. And I'd have to say that the advantage of working with the more global questions over the family is that there is more of an existing record, at least compared to my family, to engage with insights from the maps, and to see what's not being seen in the stories we tell. And I have to say, I learned more about history from working with these two methods in tandems than from 30 years as an IR scholar. So it was really enriching in that respect. Now, I want to briefly touch on two substantive and conceptual concerns before further unpacking the representative phenomena within the project. Now, epigenetics has been exploring transgenerational entanglements at the level of the individual body. What might it mean to say that social political experiences of past trauma remain entangled with the present and are, in a sense, radioactive? Now, the question regards the after effects of large-scale violence on populations and the processes by which pain is silenced and becomes unseen and thus unresolved, and precisely for this reason has a continuing resonance. It's less the trauma itself that's radioactive, than the attempt to silence, to avoid the emotions, or to look at it squarely at what happened, and the tendency to grieve selectively, all of which contribute to fragmentation. Now, the psychiatrist Bessel van der Kolk made the point that semantic memories can coexist with sensory imprints, which often remain stable over time, but then can be triggered by reminders. So by extension, one might say that if you're within a family constellation, the representative expresses affect that arises from sensory imprints within the family field. And so our question was whether these resonances of historical trauma, which are entangled with memories expressed in political discourse, could similarly be represented within a system. So are there sensory imprints or affective resonance that surround collective phenomena of different kinds? The historian and traumatologist Anne Gwynne St. Just draws on the mathematical concept of a fractal, which is evident throughout nature. If anybody's interested in exploring that, there's a YouTube film called The Color of Affinity. She uses the fractal to talk about the patterning of transgenerational trauma. So a fractal is similar to a hologram. It's a three-dimensional image that's produced from a pattern of interference, but they are different. The fractal is the pattern, and the holograph is the recording of the pattern, much as you might say trauma is the experience and memory is the record of it. So the analysis of the mapping on my part was an attempt to identify whether patterns emerge from the transcripts and how the transcripts of the sessions and how they relate to what is seen and unseen in the world. Now, seen and unseen have an important place in the feminist and critical theory, or work on images and photography. The project was more focused on identifying obstacles to seeing the unseen. So the first question is, why don't we see? Whether you're talking about individuals or collectives. Seeing in this case is less about cognitive visualization, but rather how we see or how we focus attention, And I'd point to several factors which are relevant to both individual and more collective experience. First, observation is always positional. If attention's focused on some things, it isn't focused on others. John Vervaeke, the director of the Cognitive Science program at the University of Toronto, argues that we zero in on what's relevant to us. And this isn't pure calculation, but relates to what we're connected to. But while that's generally a positive process of adapting, it's also a source of self-delusion, which he associates with the illusion of Buddhism and the First Noble Truth. So we're perpetually prone to self-deception and thus tend to ignore information that might be necessary to changing a situation. Second, our language and socialization do a lot of the work. There's a growing literature from history and political theory about how the more negative aspects of empire are written out of historical accounts, or how national histories were part of the production of empire. And there's also the empirical problem that arises from the creation or destruction of historical archives and how this shapes the writing of history and thus memory. But at least from the perspective of this project, our emotions are the core problem. There are very difficult emotions of shame, grief, and guilt associated with aspects of the past that have not been acknowledged. And the tendency is to turn away from it rather than sit with the emotions or acknowledge what happened. Mackay and I wrote a piece called The Safety Paradox, which explores a number of concepts that are relevant here. The one, unknown knowns, you might be familiar from Donald Rumsfeld, but we use it in a different way. Unknown knowns are those facts we know, for instance, enslavement in the US or colonialism on a global scale, but remain unresolved because it's too difficult to fully acknowledge them and the cause. There's a big blind spot of not knowing this past on an emotional level and what it meant and continues to mean for those who suffered then or now. Ungrieved grief or unacknowledged guilt is the result of this turning away. So the tendency is to become stuck then in patterns of behavior and memory and preoccupied with self-protection, often at the expense of or harm to others, which is another point that maps onto the Buddhist notions of three poisons of illusion, greed, and hatred. Now, grief and trauma seem to be everywhere at the moment. But the problem that we're pointing to is the selective nature of grief and how it actually tends to reinforce distinctions between those who are worthy of grief and those who are ungrievable and thus less than human, which is a distinction that was made by Judith Butler. The point from a systems perspective is the importance of acknowledging and grieving for the entangled whole, as well as giving a place to the excluded parts within the whole for any kind of resolution that might restore balance. So to take a perhaps controversial example, from this perspective, the decision not to invite Russia to participate in the 80th anniversary of the D-Day landings was a missed opportunity. Russia lost around 25 million people in World War II, by far the highest number in the world, and then followed by China. Russia was also an ally at the time. So the absence serves to reinforce the divisions in the current war rather than giving a place to World War II memory in the past, while also acknowledging the costs of that conflict in human lives and its continuing role in mattering international politics, even after decades of saying never again. So the safety paradox was a thought experiment which recast the security dilemma, shifting from an emphasis on the defensive reaction of states, the parts, to a focus on the whole, on climate emergency, and as articulated at COP27, its relationship to the legacy of colonialism, both of which we have been turning away from for decades or centuries. So a dilemma requires an either-or choice, arm or don't arm, while a paradox is both and. Rather than address the existential threat to life on the planet, war is breaking out everywhere, and much of it is bringing memories of World War II and empire to bear from very different positions. Oops, I'm lost, getting confused here. Right, to return to the mapping, the modality sets up a created system where it's possible to get a more complete view of how the parts stand in relation to one another. So in our case, rather than representing individuals, the mappers represented categories of more collective experience, such as forced displacement, war, famine, or emotions or identity. All of which related to particular intentional questions that were raised at moments in time over the 2.5 years against the backdrop of things that were happening in the world. So how do we think about what's going on here? Very insightful undergraduate student at St. Andrews named Louisa Bokelman, who was doing a review of the constellation literature for me, came up with a way of talking about it that makes a huge amount of sense, that they are like a human diffraction grating. And as such, affective resonances of what is in the world at a moment in space and time relevant to the particular question and system are diffracted, and through the speech of the mappers collapses into language. What is in this case points less to facts or some definitive reality that has been set on the future course than energetic potentials at any one moment, relating to seen and unseen aspects of a situation. The other thing that is interesting, I think, that is similar to the quantum physics experiment, is that the phenomena itself isn't seen directly, but it's known through the traces left on the apparatus, which in this case is the language spoken within the blind maps. So as the affects expressed by the representatives collapse into language, the broad outlines of how parts stand in relation to the question could be detected. Now, the further perplexing question here is the significance of seeing from a position of blindness. The sessions were undertaken blind, and that meant that the representers did not know the question that shaped any one system or session, or what category they or any of their counterparts represented. And the reason for doing this, or the objective of the blindness, was to minimize the influence of subjective consciousness of the representatives in order to explore whether patterns in fact arose from the field or the system itself. So as discussed earlier, this requires a phenomenological stance on the part of the representers of not knowing and an openness to what arises from the field. So prior to any one session, the facilitator, Mackay, and I formulated a question, usually relating to something that was going on in the world. A list of relevant categories relating to memory, historical experience, or emotion were drawn up. Each of the categories was assigned a letter. Each letter was then assigned to a representer. During the session itself, the facilitator was primarily pushing the conversation along by asking the reps to questions about who they could see and who they couldn't see, or what they were experiencing. And then this often turned into a conversation between them. And I was making word for word transcripts from the sessions based on the letters. And it was only after the session that the representers were told the question and what they were representing, after which the letters were replaced by the categories in the transcripts as a preparation for their later analysis. So the expectation in these blind conditions is that it would just be totally random jumble of words. There'd be no relationship between the categories and what was being said during the session. Now, I did an illustration of a small part of the data as it relates to World War II memory in Experiments in Entangled Time, which you can read if you're interested in getting an idea of this. And I'm sure it still raises lots of questions about where this is coming from and so forth, but you can see, hopefully some of this will be clarified. Now, the phenomenological stance of emptiness and not knowing presents a paradox regarding Wittgenstein and language, which I often come back to. In Experiments in Entangled Time, I talked about the parallel, talked about both what happened within our maps and the mathematical formula in a quantum laboratory in terms of a limited system. And I was drawing on a resemblance between Wittgenstein's language game and Bohr's arguments about language or being suspended in language. And I later realized that this parallel only goes so far. So to use the game analogy, what differentiates playing chess from moving objects randomly on a board is the player's knowledge of the rules regarding the objects, how they're used, and the context of play. So the rules are intersubjective, clearly. Somebody in China and the UK can play chess with the same rules, although they might be playing Go in China as well. But maneuvering within the game is down to the subjectivity of the particular players and the decisions they're making. A Wittgensteinian framework, while useful for thinking about a limited system, doesn't get to the core problem of the blind mapping. If the representers had no knowledge of the context or the categories, how would it be possible for patterns of any kind to emerge from the language of the blind maps? And this suggests that sensory imprints or affective resonances, or whatever you want to call them, are attached to phenomena, whether individual or collective, and these tell a story of their own that is beyond the stories we consciously tell to ourselves, are often different than them. So this is not least the case regarding that which is unseen in our everyday language. So I think this is very close to the way Jay Garfield was talking about phenomena in Buddhism. Now, one might reasonably ask how this would all be possible with just humans rather than technology, or to know that the patterns are really there. Now, Mackay had a different cut into the analysis than I did. It was more in keeping with the very intuitive approach of the constellations. I wanted evidence. I did this, as I already suggested, I did an initial analysis that isolated World War II as a dominant memory. I made two cuts, one within a particular map at a point in time, which you could, within a particular session, which you might call a positional reading. The other looked at what the memory was doing over time, or its momentum, and whether in the context of several maps over the period of a year prior to the Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the qualities, emotions, etc., associated with World War II resonated with what it's like to be World War II memory. So it was war, not diplomacy. It was about revenge, not compassion. And I'd add that the space for World War II memory was represented by different people in any one map. And again, the process was blind. A key question that was raised by the research is whether the two modes, this very intuitive mode of the constellations and the more detailed mode of focusing attention, can be brought together to get a more complete view, or whether in fact my attempt to analyze the language in detail is actually counterproductive. Now, there are a number of reasons why the detail might be counterproductive, but I just want to focus on one point here. A Scottish psychiatrist, Ian McGilchrist, argues that two sides of the brain, both sides of the brain are involved in decision making and emotions and rationality, but the two sides of the brain focus attention in different ways. The left brain focuses on the detail, on getting things done, on the acquisition of power, pleasure or things, abstraction. And this is part of the whole global dynamic of arms races, competitions for resources and empire, which is destructive from the perspective of the whole. The right brain, by contrast, is more expansive, intuitive, and provides a more complete view related to meaning, the sacred, and higher values that call us forward. McGilchrist's main point is that we assume that the left brain is the master, but it's actually the emissary. The right brain is the rightful master, and he claims that we live in a left brain world, and this is leading us to self-destruction. We need a more complete view, which will open up potentials for more expansive thinking and a more sustainable future. Now, constellations, I would argue, provide a tool for expanding and becoming attuned to right brain awareness. But this also requires then a rethinking of the mind-body relationship, particularly to grasp the notion that the representer feels into a represented space. We usually think of the mind as leading, but the mind and body, from this perspective, are deeply interconnected. As already suggested, the representative phenomena involves an entangled knowing of affective resonances attached to phenomena, which are different than articulations of trauma or memory in everyday language. Feeling into a space involves emptying the mind of categories and convictions that we might be carrying around with us, to instead attune oneself to what arises from the field, again from a position of not knowing. So the imprints or resonances appear as fragments or traces rather than coherent narratives. Now, it's one thing if an individual experience of trauma expresses itself in the body as much as the mind. Do such affective resonances exist in the body of the world? If we're all walking wave functions, as Alex argues, those waves don't stop at the border of the body, or the family for that matter. As Karen Barad argues, memory is written into the fabric of the world. We don't generally notice because we aren't paying attention, and beliefs about science make it difficult to consider. And I would say that the experience of consciousness within the maps is, on one level, not qualitatively different than everyday conscious, aside from the latter being more explicitly subjective. The constellations are a tool for observing the resonances as they relate to one another, whether attached to individuals, objects, or more collective phenomena. So, in moving toward a conclusion, I want to return to the subject of cognitive dissonance. This is something that I struggled with throughout. I've been more of a critical scholar than ever a social scientist from the beginning, but I really struggled with what it means to be doing this kind of work in an academic context where it would be quickly by many put in the category of non-scientific mysticism, paranormal, or worse. And I was also straddling both parts of the project, so I was simultaneously engaging with both forms of attention throughout the whole thing, which was quite mind-boggling. The other cognitive dissonance arose from what became a very visceral sense of my position in the world as regards seeing the scale and history of human suffering. The contrast between good objective science and bad mysticism obscures the whole history of suppressing other knowledge systems that accompanied practices of empire. And the result is this false dichotomy between a world that exists independent of us and a mystical realm that is transcendent, as distinct from the immanence of consciousness and our participant observation, our participation in the experiment of life. So the constellations may be spooky, but the sketches of historical trauma unearthed by the RAs, research assistants, were often really horrific. And as I said earlier, engaging with history and its meaning with these tools has had a huge impact on what I see going on in the world. And this isn't just a matter of new facts, but of experiencing a more visceral sense of the history and the costs of survival for populations at different times within it. But even one's positioning within this looks different once you shift away from thinking of yourself merely as an individual self positioned in the world, and instead a transgenerational and relational self that is deeply connected with a whole range of past historical experiences where, you know, trauma has been very widespread. So the cognitive dissonance was an important part of the process, and arguably what's most important about the modality and as a potential pedagogical tool. What a pedagogical application would look like and how to use it safely is an open question that requires further exploration. The experiment raised an important question about the left brain emphasis of academia on reason and rationality, and whether an experiential modality that relies on the right brain and a much different orientation to knowing can have a place in that world. So is it possible to rethink thinking in more complementary terms and reposition ourselves toward a more holographic understanding of the world and its past, and thus a more complete view of some of the existential threats and potentials we face as a planet? So just a few thoughts, I don't know how I'm doing on time, but about why this is important and how the modality might be useful. First, and what it's not. First, it's not about talking to the dead nor hocus pocus or fairy synapses. It points to the existence of resonances of memory that are there, but we don't normally pick up on because they are unobservable and we don't take them seriously. Just stop and look for a moment at the role of Holocaust memory and genocide in both Israel and Gaza, or World War II memory for just about every party to the conflict in Ukraine, or memories of empire on the part of China and Russia, among others. So, leaders may be manipulating the language of memory, but arguably the memory itself, once out there, is attached to wave functions that sort of um, have a life of their own because of this, because of the history and the triggering and the emotions attached to them. So second, the modality isn't useful as a form of strategic empathy. This is a concept that's appeared in some of the strategic literature. The facilitator doesn't manipulate variables or control the situation. Information arises from the field, and more often than not, it presents a way of looking that is surprising and one wasn't expecting. The attention isn't to fix a problem or provide insight into the thinking of opponents so that you can take strategic advantage of them, but rather to expand awareness and see a broader range of potentials. Viveka or McGilchrist associate cognitive empathy with the left brain, which is about how I'm going to play you, as distinct from the values that come from relations, or that which gives meaning, which relates to the right brain. So more airstrikes that destroy more bodies and create more forced displacement or environmental damage to one side's strategic advantage, or some assumption that we can fix things, isn't the point. A shift of emphasis to the transgenerational effects of trauma should instead raise serious questions about the strategies that seek to kill off a threat, but from this perspective of unresolved trauma, actually reproduce violence. Getting a more complete view of what is, and seeing a broader array of potentials is the point. It's also important to emphasize the greater potential for compassion that comes from the more visceral experience of the human suffering, and seeing from the perspective of the whole rather than the individual parts, which also, I think, carries a potential for remembering, concept that Rabbi Shilliam and others use. It's a reconstitution of what has become an overly fragmented world. Now, I just want to end with some thoughts about how the exploratory research relates to further research. I've been thinking with a science and technology studies researcher at the Institute of Advanced Studies in Vienna, named Robert Brown, who made me aware of a distinction between exploratory research, which is the project just completed, as opposed to basic research or applied research. I think distinctions must be more common in the natural sciences. The Empire project took an observation that was outside the perimeters of social science research and asked a radical question about the feasibility of doing research on it. The Constellations raised questions about non-local entanglement in a way that's more related to the subatomic concerns of physicists, and thus provides a potential bridge between the two. The distinction between exploratory and basic research was hugely reassuring to me, as I was really struggling to say anything definitive by way of conclusion. The idea is that there's a further stage of research, further stages of research beyond what Mackay and I did, which makes it easier to gather some insights without trying to make bold claims. First, I would say there were rudimentary patterns relating to global entanglements from within the blind experiment, but there's a remaining question of how to do this better, and whether engaging with detailed transcripts conflicts with gaining perspective on the whole. Second, the patterns in the mapping suggest the sensory imprints or affective resonance are attached to phenomena. individuals and are phenomena, but so are more collective experiences or even objects. And these resonances don't represent an essence. And this, again, is very similar to the discussion, Garfield's discussion of Buddhism. They appear differently depending on their positioning vis-a-vis other parts within a limited system observed from a particular position in space-time. So the constellations, the third point I would make is that the constellations have the potential to form the basis of social technologies. Now, one of the instructors in this training that I'm doing used the language of social technology and an analogy. His name is Giulio Principa. He used the language of a social technology and an analogy to a GPS. And I was really intrigued by this, but also somewhat uncomfortable with it at first because the language of technology is so closely married to a very Newtonian conception of machines. But here the idea is to reclaim technology as a way to enhance human practical knowledge and to refocus attention with the right brain. So its next step might be to deepen understanding of the quantum effects and how they relate to consciousness in the world, as well as thinking more explicitly about what a related quantum social technology might look like. Having done most of the project evaluation, I still have a number of questions, which I may mention if I'm not completely out of time. We accumulated lots of data, but it was difficult to analyze or to publish for a number of reasons, partly related to how we set up the project, as well as changing institutional research guidelines over the duration of the project. So, you know, I think it provides a basis for thinking again about how to do this in other ways. And this larger question about the place of the more attention to intuitive right brain thinking within the left brain academia. I would say there is sufficient evidence from my perspective to take this further and maybe even a moral or ethical imperative to do so in light of the explosion of interest in artificial intelligence and its more negative potentials. We need to get beyond the stigmatization of work on human consciousness as spooky, non-scientific mysticism, and to recognize that the constellations are a way to look more systematically at the working of consciousness in all of us, of our humanity, and how we're contributing to the destruction of the planet. And just briefly, the further concerns, anybody who's tempted to go out and set up a constellation, I would just say it is really important to work with somebody who has training in certification in this, knows what's happening with it, or to acquire the skills yourself. And this is true of any method or modality. And in this case, there are particular issues relating to the centrality of trauma that make this an ethical imperative. And as I've already suggested, what's the best way to do this? Or what's the best way to understand the relationship between more academic and intuitive aspects? Or can there be any relationship? Can the two work together? Or is ultimately the right brain focus more crucial for gaining a more complete view? So the approach we adopted does raise a question about whether client is needed and what this means in relation to the more global approach. And the discussion of subjective object relations in the last session also made me think about this a little more. Since several people have mentioned the importance of setting up constellations from the perspective of an individual client. And this makes sense in the context of, family and organizational systems. When we began the Mapping the Empire project, we were asking a question about whether it was possible to represent the entanglements themselves rather than from the perspective of an individual problem. And the blindness gave some insight into the affective resonances surrounding more collective phenomena, but this is a somewhat different question than how it might work as a social technology. And if an individual client is the only entry point, then there's a big question about, what this looks like in relation to more global phenomena and how to go about that. Thank you very much, and I hope that made some sense and isn't too spooky. So.
Well, thank you, Karen, for the very absorbing presentation. We've got a couple of questions. I'm still formulating some thoughts, but I may have a question at the end. But I want everyone else to have a chance first. So we have a question from Ann Pender regarding left-right brain differences in understanding, analysis, and meaning making. I'm intrigued about whether there is any possibility of differences between left and right-handed people in their experience and memory of events, given that for left-handed people, the right-hand side of the brain is more dominant in their engagement in the world. Might there be greater potential for them to have a more expansive, integrative perspective? Also, are there any possible implications of this in the wider world, given that the vast majority of humans are right-handed and thus more dominated by the left-hand side of their brain? So.
That's really actually an interesting question.
Yeah.
I mean, when we used to think about left brain and right brain, we thought about rationality and emotions, and part of what McGilchrist was doing was debunking that. But yeah, what does it mean? There are a lot of people that were forced to write right hand, and therefore are ambidextrous and use their left hand for other things. I'm just the opposite. I write with my left hand for I have no good explanation for this, but I do everything else with the right. And I have asked myself that question: does that make it easier to deal with the more intuitive aspects, as well as the more rational? Although I will confess, Alex, I don't know if you had this experience, but I was very conscious in going through graduate school that that intuitive side of me was just. And so this has been bringing it back. And I mean, the point is that we all do have two sides of the brain. So what does it mean if you haven't been embracing one side, how you might do that? But these are two very different worlds, which the academia and the people doing the constellation works. And I don't, there hasn't been that much conversation between them. And I think there are some interesting questions to be asked, but I think there needs to be openness. You bring a group of academics into a room and ask them to attune to themselves, and they'll give you a rational argument. So it's how you get out of yourself again, to see things differently.
Good. Okay. We have another question from Matthew. We are indeed stuck in the cycle of violent conflict at present and at many levels from IR to interpersonal. From this, perhaps this experiential modality may be just the extra energy to knock us into another energy potential. How might we combine this with Bohmian dialogue and other mind-opening practices to move towards the results you mentioned? Are anticipated after the exploration experiments you presented. Looking for next steps, you see this leading towards what? So.
I think one thing I would say is that I'm not familiar with Bohmian dialogues, but I assume it has some resonance with this, just from what I know about Bohm. But I've also been conscious that, this whole question of beginning to see things that we're not willing to look at. People are doing this in all kinds of ways, and have been doing it, often not being seen doing it. But I mean, I think that was one of the points of the constellations, is that there is part of this exercise that potentially removes those obstacles, and that how one explains how that happens. Again, the assumption is that this happens in the field itself rather than anything anyone deliberately sets out to do. But the important thing is that we turn toward something that we've resisted just because it's too painful. It's sort of how we deal with emotions, not dealing with them, shutting them out, having a stiff upper lip, but that process of acknowledgement is really important. I mean, that's precisely what the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commissions were about, and any number of other Truth and Reconciliation Commissions since. One of the problems with the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission was that this individual one-shot storytelling tended to re-traumatize people. That from my experience, Constellations are much more gentle. In fact, in some ways, you don't even have to know people's stories. It comes out of these movements. The person who's the client is hardly saying anything. That sounds bizarre and unimaginable, but yeah, I think it's that once you see, I mean, the the you take any one person from Eastern Europe or Germany or the US, and you look back in their transgenerational lineage, and you're probably going to see some horrific experiences of trauma. And it's been interesting with the broader exposure to people in the context of the training, the extent to which those percolate across generations and into people's lives, but they're not even aware of them. All they see is violence or addiction or problems of one sort or another. And what has been very interesting is how you can simply start with a symptom or a general problem and unfold this whole historical context where this may have originated in a trauma. So I'm not saying this is a solution to everything, or that people aren't already. There's an awful lot of work being done on acknowledging the past of slavery, enslavement in the Caribbean and in the United States. There's a lot of blowback on that as well. This is just one tool that I think is has some fascinating potentials and are useful to well, I mean, yeah, that is the question. Are you always starting with some individual's problem? We were trying to sort of look at larger global systems, but there are some questions about how you can better go into that.
Great. Okay. So Leslie asks, excellent presentation. At the beginning, you mentioned why people find it hard to accept new thinking, quantum. Can you restate these 3 reasons and discuss the deeper underlying why for this difficulty? Fear, survival instinct, loss of power, control, question mark. So how do we best proceed to bring in these ideas in ways that they can be received or at least pondered?
I would say that a lot of it is those the issues I raised about seeing and not seeing, or why we see or don't see. We carry a lot of assumptions around with us. We are trained to understand how to have a particular understanding of what science and is not science, and that it's almost automatic. And that's what I was talking about when I was saying I had cognitive dissonance, because I was continuously pushing up against that. There are other traditions of science. If you look at the supreme science of the rishis in India, to go back to Jay Garfield's emphasis on Buddhism, the rishis were Hindus actually. But so is this Galileo Newtonian Descartesian approach to science and knowledge the only one? Or even those who are being critical of it, to what extent are we still very much trapped in that? I mean, the other thing I found, we're trying to think nonlinear in terms of nonlinearity and continuously falling into linearity. And I don't think that's an either or either, because the way telling stories and so on and so forth is important. It's a part of the way we structure life and lives. But those stories are selective, and there comes a point where you have to, or at least if you want to go beyond them and look at something different, you need to draw those stories into question and what might be hiding behind them. And there is then those things we don't look at in terms of the whole historical context in which particular assumptions about science and objective knowledge have emerged, and the relationship to the repression of other knowledge cultures. So, you know, we carry around a lot about what the world is like, and that world isn't quantum. And even when you start to think of it, embrace the quantum side, there's a lot of pushback, both inside and outside, that well, Alex, you must know that from trying to write about quantum consciousness.
Yeah, actually, I just noticed that Joyce may have had her hand up for a while, so I'm going to let Joyce cut in to the line, and then we'll get back to the screen. So Joyce, do you want to ask a question?
Thank you. I mean, I'm sorry, I apologize for cutting the line, but I guess it's very interesting current thing for the talk. I wonder, like this data you presented is very rich and interesting. It's very quantitative. How I wonder, for example, in the early talk you mentioned like entanglement emerge. So what do you mean from the data you saw? What do you mean by? I guess how you prove or disapprove finding evidence this entanglement in this data, because the entanglement is so come with a formalism about how what's entangled state and what's not.
Can I riff on that? Because that was actually related closely to my question is very simple. What was spooky in the data? Because you talked about what was spooky about your results, which would indicate that there were quantum effects as opposed to baseline classical. I mean, is that a fair riff on your question, Joyce?
Perfect.
Are you asking me what was spooky in the?
Yeah, I think both of us are asking about sort of what was the quantum aspect.
Well, the quantum, the main thing was where it came from, which was the blind engagement. And that's what's really hard to get your head around. And Michael was asking about this beforehand as well. How do you get to that language? Basically, what I did is, after putting the categories into the transcripts, I strung the text together. There was some discourse analysis in there in terms of your relationships and up, down, around, dealing with what was in there. But I mean, as in any discourse analysis, are you seeing relationships that are of one kind or another that resonate with what's in the world? So that's what's impossible to get your head around. I half question it myself. How could that possibly have come from there? Did I make it up? But I mean, it was a very, very detailed analysis. I also have to say that I had a very intense experience around doing that analysis, because I was going back into documents that many of them, that were the transcripts that were a year or two old at that point. And I never had any problem working with the mapping. In the mapping, we had protocols for going in and out of it so that you sort of come back into the everyday. But I had this, it's just like I was experiencing the energy that was there at the time that the mapping was taking place. And here I was looking at several different sessions which took place over a period of time. So this was one of the reasons I actually stopped working with the data and wondered whether it was useful both for getting a complete view, because this was just one memory and there's an awful lot more information within that. But it also raised the question of whether proof is really the objective. And that again is getting back to as scientists, we want proof. I was looking for evidence. I think there's an argument that insofar as that language within the blind maps was picking up on something, that it does relate to something much larger than us. and that maybe it's better not represented in language. And that's why I mean, that question about how you're going, if you're going into it with the right brain or the left brain. I was going in with the left brain, and I think that complete view maybe is easier, where you're not trying to prove that this relates to something and this relates to something. And I would say, again, from the perspective of a meditation, if you take that and look at it, what does this tell us about the world? If does this make us think differently about World War II memory? If in fact we can, I don't know whether you notice it when you're listening to political elites, but they in Ukraine, every single time, from whatever angle people are talking about it, they're talking about World War II. That suggests it's still alive. It's still very much permeating all of our lives, and is certainly permeating the lives of people in Ukraine. And that's more than just the language. That's all the families and individuals and so forth who still on some level are experiencing something of that past in their lives, and not least if they're in the midst of a war itself. But even for those, have an earlier parts of Europe that had the earlier experience of World War II. I assume that's not a satisfying answer, but it's
Well, I would follow
It's a
up.
very
I
hard
don't-
question. I was
What?
just wondering, it's a very hard question, but thank you so much for
Yeah.
sharing your experience and perspective. I was wondering, this goes back to what Leslie was asking about the challenge about getting things accepted. I guess, like, to my experience, actually, it might be when I read more about the existing, the region in my field in my early years. Actually, it's like so interesting that I found it's not radical at all. The ideas is so intuitive. Like Alex was mentioning, it's intuitive. I guess for many of us,
What is it? What is intuitive?
like the relational reality ideas, like in our, even we don't explicitly, as a scholar, as a person, explicitly say it, but actually somehow it's ambiguous there. I think many even cognitive scientists, psychologists, in the writing and in the, for example, social psychology, constructive view about memory and so on. Of course, the memory, collective memory, will influencing the society and formation, language, communication, and so on. A lot of detailed memory models. But I guess, like, it was fair. The challenging difficulty we encountered at the beginning doing this kind of work was more about, we can explain it already. We have explanation. So then we have to find harder ways to find the places or the data that's really hard to explain. I guess it's still an ongoing effort, of course. But I think it's very
You're saying that working on memory generally, the data is difficult.
I mean, memory is a giant field in psychology and cognitive science. So there are many models and theories about different kinds of memory, and debates about memory systems and different, whether there were separate neural substrates with different systems and so on. But I guess it's not beyond, it's maybe a different example is that I'm quite excited about your data. I wonder whether, actually one of my students with a lot of experience with big data is in the audience. Like, actually another student who now is assistant professor, we have been looking hard with the large data in the website, the large network data, and trying to see, did hard work coding the data and so on, doing something like exactly looking at whether quantum has a better way to find something that's a better explanation for the current, like, network theory or the big data analytic method. I also know probably some audience have big data experience here. So, but I think it's challenging for us in the prior effort is finding the precise way we can falsify theories. Because, for example, a lot of social psychology theory, you can develop a lot of classical model based on Newtonian theory or quantum model, different versions of quantum model. To to account for the same data. So it's really to work very hard to see where making new predictions or making very different predictions among those different theories, even models, computational models. So I would just want to point out, follow up this challenge. But yeah, I think there are more questions. I will shut up. Thank you. I mean, this is fantastic effort and data. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, we've got 8, looks like 9 questions or 6 that have not already. So I'm going to go quickly. So from Stephen, I'm based in Nairobi and work with trauma healing and futures consciousness within the framework of Ukama, a Shona concept from Zimbabwe that takes an intergenerational perspective on the nature of our being. Karen, could you expound more on how you see entanglement being applied to working with transgenerational trauma transformative healing, especially in how it engages with the ancestors and living dead? You also mentioned speaking with the dead as hocus pocus, but I reside in a region where there is an active element of their worldview, spiritual practice, and praxis in everyday life.
Well, I think that's a fair point, and I think this came up in the last talk as well. I think the language that you use, there are so many different conceptual languages for talking about the same thing, and in fact, in this case, Hellinger was very much influenced by what he observed among the Zulu peoples, and it maps onto sort of transgenerational notions in African Ubuntu, and one of the points he was making in regard to the Zulu was that after somebody died, that a place would be made for them in the home of the family, as a way of acknowledging that they are still an important part, even though they are of the family, even though they are gone. So yeah, I suppose I was in saying it's not hocus pocus or talking to the dead. I realize that there are some people who would talk in those terms, but I was thinking in terms of an audience where seeing that would be one of the triggers where you'd say there'd be a shutdown. No, we can't go there. That's not something we do. So yes, I think that notion, and most cultures outside of the West do have a much better sense of transgenerational lineages, of the importance of honoring ancestors. I think the fact that we don't is, you could ask big questions about that. Why wouldn't you be attentive to the people? Well, Americans say I came from here or there or there or there. To what extent have they thought of I think a lot of people are now looking at the lineages from which they came from, and particularly people who were forcefully brought to the United States in Africa, from Africa. So I don't want to discount that language, and I apologize for any offense that may have been caused by it, but it was more trying to make the point that this is about the world we live in, and how do we begin to open up and look at it more broadly, but the issue of how we frame things really is both so important, but it can confuse things because you can talk about the same thing using a very, very different language. Just as we were saying, a lot of the themes that run through quantum theory have a resonance with Buddhism, have a resonance with African philosophy, have a resonance with Taoism. Whether a quantum physicist would be happy talking about that, I don't know. Well, Warren Heisenberg made that the parallel, at least to the Asian philosophies, and I think recognizing that parallel then does become important for looking at the history itself. I hope that answers your question. Oh, I don't think it answered it so much in terms of how you address the transgender trauma. The point I would make there is that if you are in an African context, you already have a rich reservoir of knowledge, I think, that is more indigenous to the area and might be useful for looking at.
Okay. Turning to Marguerite, do you think that cultural production and diplomacy should be given more space in international relations? I'm interested in how to approach these conversations without causing re-traumatization.
Approach what conversations?
Um,
About diplomacy or within diplomacy?
Cultural production and diplomacy should be given more space. Yeah, it's a little bit, I'm not quite sure.
I think what needs to be, I mean, diplomacy is, in one definition, is about trying to talk rather than kill each other or kill the messenger. But I think there is certainly an important place for thinking about how knowledge systems interact at the global level, and to what extent relations of power influence how discussions takes place, and who's seen and who's not seen, and who's considered a speaker and who's not considered a speaker. Vivian Jabri and I wrote a piece called Global Conversations, which isn't about diplomacy so much, but it is about dialogue, and it is about trauma and emotions. Can't even remember. Oh, it's in a journal called Global Constitutionalism. That might be interesting for you to look at. It makes side references to the quantum stuff, but it's much more about that, what it means to communicate, particularly against the backdrop of histories of power relationships where people have been harmed.
Okay. Vivan Sousa, regarding familiar constellation, or maybe family constellation, there are several controversial and serious critiques in Brazil around this practice, and Bert Hellinger's statements about abuse. More than the understanding of science or not, academic knowledge or not, are those critiques on the research radar?
Well, I don't think there is any academic research on the constellations side. Well, aside from this project, well, no, that isn't true. There is academic research that's been done, and particularly in Germany. I think that is definitely on the radar in the psychotherapeutic conversation about it. I'm not an expert on Hellinger himself, but he did make certain kinds of claims that, from the perspective of what we might consider legitimate these days, would be extremely controversial. Yeah. So, and I think a lot of people who've since worked with it have rethought some of those things or pushed up against them. But I have heard some of the claims you've made, and I would understand why they would be shocking, and why they would be controversial. So, yeah, he was a controversial figure. There's no question.
Okay, we've got 5 minutes, so we've got too many people. I think the list is getting longer and longer, actually. That's a good sign, but I'm not sure we'll get through to everybody. But Christina asks, is it possible to move activated energy from the left side of the brain to the right side for congruency of inner world resonance, emptiness, reflecting in a metaphorical stance?
Oh goodness, I'm not sure I understand
Yeah, I'm
that.
not sure if you want to give it a try.
I would say the first place to start would be with meditation. In terms of the main concern about shifting into a more of a right brain, because it is that sense of emptying the mind, of relying less on the categories that, rational thinking, rational narrative, And instead, I mean, if you're out walking, it's really interesting experience to try to just stop thinking. And it's amazing the extent to which you then start hearing things around you, like birds and this and that and this. And I think that's one of the things that's important about no mind as part of fighting, is that you actually miss out on a lot of, regards to your movements of your enemy and so forth. If your mind is preoccupied with, well, how am I going to get from here to there, and what's the meaning of this? So it is it's not, again, it's not like nothingness, but that emptiness opens up the senses so that you have a larger experience than if you're thinking, how am I going to get from A to B? Which is, I think there's something to it, actually. Looking at some decisions I've made by thinking through A, B, A, B, A, B, A, B, and wasted a lot of time because the right solution just appeared when it was necessary. There's a book called Zen and the, do you remember this book, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle
Oh
Maintenance?
yeah, I read that as a teenager. That's my
Yeah.
generation.
Yes, that central idea has always stuck with me as well. I don't know if it's relevant to this, but if something, you're just working so hard to do something and it just isn't coming together, best thing to do is just walk away, come back, and it will fix itself. So don't push the water, it runs by itself.
All right, time for maybe one or two more. Karen writes, thank you, Karen. I am, for the last 3 decades, engaged in constellation work and a facilitator since 1998. I am German, living in Colorado, and so glad to find your questions and research within this event. I would love to connect with you for an exchange if you're open for that. More to your presentation and a request now, I am trauma educated for the same time of decades, and use the method to address and often mend individual and generational trauma as well. I would love to hear a bit about you, not on that detail. Sounds like maybe you should have a conversation with.
Yeah, I'd love to, actually. It's yeah, I don't know if you if you just Google me at the University of St. Andrews, you can just send me an email and maybe I can answer the question better in that way. Because I wasn't quite sure what the last bit of it was, but I was curious whether there would be anybody in the audience who has any experience with this. So, yeah, it's good to hear that.
Mm-hmm. Drinka, can you please say more about the technical processes? Did you repeat constellations about one story with a few cohorts? Are there difficult results in that case? Also, what are the results, or what exactly means accepting what is? Is there some kind of a conflict resolution? In Hellinger's work, there's almost always some kind of resolution in the sense of actively respecting of what is.
Yes. Yes. It's sort of a hard concept to get your head around. I think it's pointing to that once you start to see those unseen parts that are missing from a system, some of which are unseen for very horrific reasons, things that have happened in the past and haven't been acknowledged, or people who've gone through terrible, terrible experiences. The principle is that seeing that, you accept it, you whether it's horrific or whether it's beautiful. But there's also something, I think this is particularly true in relation to the families. It's a different reorientation to looking at your family if you're not seeing just your parents through the present and how they're irritating you or causing all kinds of problems, but instead seeing them in the context of their lives and things that have happened to them. I mean, that was when I talked about this experience of quantum effects in the first constellation I had. It was a response to bits of my mother's life that I hadn't been aware of and that happened before I had been born, that put her and the whole family relationship in a totally different perspective, and one that was conducive to compassion. Whether that factually was relating to something factually that happened, or was just something in the system, the fact in this case is a difficult concept. It is much more about energetic things. So, but that ability to see what is in a more complete sense, and to say, yes, I acknowledge that exists, and that has a place, and that also, you can then maybe be more compassionate towards something that you may have approached from in a very hostile way, which opens a different kind of conversation insofar as you're dealing with people in the present. Anyway, sorry, that's a bit long-winded.